Welcome to you all. I'm Ciarán Cuffe, and this is the Harnessing Our Ocean Energy webinar. You're all very welcome to the event. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers this morning. Just by way of introduction, I sit on the ITRI, the Energy Committee of the European Parliament, and it's an extraordinarily exciting time to be active on the European stage in the move towards making the European Green Deal a reality. We have set significant targets for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions in Europe by just under 55% by the year 2030. Although this is not as high as science demands, it is still an extraordinarily ambitious target. And to deliver these targets, we will have to massively increase our share of renewable energy on the grid and in our everyday lives. So we need new legislation at a European level, but also here at home. At a European level, we're looking at revisions of the Renewable Energy Directive, the Energy Efficiency Directive, and other legislation around the field of energy. A lot of it is in place, but a lot more needs to be done. Here at home, we also have ambitious plans. We have now a draft National Marine Planning Framework, draft revised wind energy development guidelines, and we've seen the general scheme of the Marine Planning and Development Management Bill. But we still need to modernize our legislation. The Foreshore Act, for instance, dates from 1933, and I was looking back at the debates around it on the Oireachtas website, and much of the arguments that took place back then were the competing demands from those who were harvesting seaweed, sand, and oysters. And in a similar way, today, 90 years later, there are still competing demands on our maritime space. There are demands to protect our biodiversity, our fishing grounds, our large cetaceans, and the wealth of ocean life and biodiversity. There's also concerns around the impact that significant offshore energy will have on our fishing grounds, on our marine protected areas, both current and future, and the visual impact of wind farms on our skylines. But we certainly do feel that ocean energy will be a large part of our plans to decarbonise here in Ireland. And it is a really exciting time as we look at further interconnectors to our European Union colleagues and member states, and as we look at new legislation coming through. And just within the last month, we've seen the ESB produce an ambitious €5 billion plan to transform electricity production at Money Point from coal burning to offshore wind production. We have Airgrid launching a public consultation on shaping our energy future. And I think there is significant ambition out there in the Irish context. Nonetheless, we want to see community gains. We want to see the visual impact and the impact on our fisheries carefully assessed before we go further into large-scale ocean energy production. And we want to ensure that all voices are heard in this debate. And that's why we have a range of stakeholders here today. And over the next 2 hours, I'm certainly looking forward to hearing from some of the leaders in this sector, both on the civil society side of things, but also on the industry side. And we are absolutely delighted to have with us the Minister for Energy, Environment, Climate and Communications, and the Minister for Transport, who is Eamon Ryan TD. Eamon is currently the leader of the Green Party Comhaontas Glas. I've known Eamon for an embarrassingly long time, I think around about 50 years at this stage. And I'm delighted to have him here with us as a keynote speaker. So without further ado, can I please welcome you, Eamon, to say a few words?
Thank you, Ciarán. I think it's actually 49 years, Ciarán. And I hope you get your vaccination protocol in today. If you haven't got one in Brussels, it's our day today to get on the register. That shows how old we are. I really appreciate the chance to speak to you and the very large audience large group we have on the Zoom here today. I want to maybe just set a context. Just go back a wee bit in time of the history of this offshore wind. That'll help with the really interesting lineup of people you're contributing today. Ireland was actually one of the first countries to develop offshore wind. The 6 or 7, I can't remember the number, but the turbines on the Arklow Bank within sight of British Bay Beach was one of the early projects. Eddie O'Connor and Airtricity, I think was the time, were really ahead of the game. They're General Electric turbines, I think. They've been working steadily ever since, 16 years in a very salty, marine, harsh environment. We kind of, at that time, and I was fortunate to be Energy Minister from 2007, there was significant interest. We had a lot of projects which were starting to be developed on the East Coast, particularly up in Dundalk, in the bay there, in Dublin Bay, around that East Coast bank. But none of them advanced. And I suppose at the time, we were also very much advancing onshore wind, which had a comparative competitive advantage. It was much cheaper. Offshore wind was still expensive. But we did at the time see the potential. And we were one of the signatories as a country, 10 countries signing the North Sea's Offshore Grid Initiative, which was based on a belief that in the long run, offshore wind would be able to give us 100% renewable zero carbon energy system, or it would be one of the key power supplies that would allow us meet that climate goal and energy security goal. And it was always about energy security as well, not being reliant on imported gas and oil. But those projects, that North Sea's Offshore Grid Initiative was combining how we interconnect between countries and interconnect offshore wind into that, recognizing that really when we look at this in a big regional scale, if you just think about the weather systems coming into Europe, cross over Ireland coming from the Gulf Stream, cross over UK North Sea, go into the Baltic. At some point along that line, at some point there will typically be wind. So it gives you balancing capability. And also the really big long-term prize thinking. Can we connect hydro from Scandinavia and the Alps, solar from the south with wind from the northwest? And it was thinking really strategically. It was called the supergrid. I think Eddie O'Connor again was involved in that, some of the framing of that back in the day. But we didn't, for the last 15 years, progress offshore wind. We did progress onshore and became very successful at integrating of onshore in a synchronized, isolated grid that the island of Ireland is. Airgrid developed real capability in that. But in the last 5-7 years, I suppose, things have changed again. The cost of offshore wind has dropped significantly. It mainly started to drop thanks in truth to the Danes and Dutch and German and then British governments changing the auction system so that they de-risked the investment, and by doing that bring down the cost. And as the scale came up, then it started to become much more competitive. And also the potential development of floating offshore wind. So most of the offshore wind to date has been turbine driven into the sandbank or to the seabed. But the potential now opening up of floating offshore wind, which is at an early stage, but which gives the potential to go into deeper waters and again, further expanding. And with that, we are now starting to look at offshore wind at scale. Politically, it was identified in I'd credit, I think, the Joint Oireachtas Committee that in the last Dáil, which set a 70% renewables target for 2030, which Richard Bruton picked up in the last Climate Action Plan, which is in our current Climate Action Plan, our current programme for government. And that was based on the recognition that with the cost of offshore wind coming down, it was now time for us to start tapping into it. And that's where we're at. We are now at a stage where we're really going to launch and go big in offshore wind. We've committed to some 5 gigawatts in this decade, and then a further 30 gigawatts as we move further offshore, particularly into floating wind in the coming decades. And I think those targets actually may well in the end be conservative, that we may be able to go quicker and more significantly ahead of schedule in some of the deadlines. We'll need to do it because we're going to have challenges in other parts of our climate targets. The approach has been taken is, well, firstly, there are a number of those legacy projects that have been in the planning system effectively for the last 10, 15 years, which have a lot of the necessary consents, which have done a lot of the work and assessment of bird life and other environmental assessments, will proceed first. So we'll have an auction system probably early next year, which will see some of those legacy projects, I would call them, being developed with a grid connection directly into shore. All, I think, with one exception on the east coast, there's one on the west coast, on the far west of Connemara, but all the rest running from sort of Dundalk Bay area down to Arklow Bank area. They will connect directly into the existing grid infrastructure and connecting as well into the areas like Dublin, where there's a huge electricity demand, and therefore it's easier to, there's real synergy when you've large new power sources, and these would be significant projects tapping into Dublin, where there's a huge demand for electricity and a strong grid infrastructure, still needed to be upgraded. We will then, as this decade evolves, go into a series of further auctions and into other waters, into the Celtic Sea, into the west. People will have seen that big project announcement that ESB and Equinor are looking at, which is the first kind of the really ambitious offshore floating projects. Equinor, formerly Statoil, the big Norwegian state company, have real expertise in that area. So them teaming up with the ESB is an example of how this is likely to go. It is the key regulatory aspects of this is the Maritime Area Planning Bill, which Minister Darragh O'Brien is due to introduce very shortly. It will integrate in a way that needs to be done anyway, all aspects of offshore marine planning, so that be it fisheries or cabling or defence issues or aquaculture or marine protected areas, or the whole area of marine planning, maritime area planning needs to be integrated. And it's absolutely critical that we put good environmental planning practice central to everything we do. As you say, this cannot work if it's not sustainable in every way, particularly in terms of bird life and marine habitat, which I believe, but science has to back this up, can be enhanced with the introduction of offshore turbines, which create and affect protected areas in their own right, from fisheries or from bottom trawling or other activities, which could bring real potential environmental benefits. But we have to be sensitive to bird feeding and other maritime environmental issues in how we do this. It will also be contentious, and we should be upfront in this in terms of visual effect, and particularly in the first projects on the east coast, which will be visible from the shore, vary depending on, each project will vary somewhat, but that is going to be a very contentious issue. Every project will have to go through the planning system. There'll be different views on that. We have to minimize the visual interception, and that will, there's a kind of a multiplicity of factors here. The turbines are getting larger, ever larger. There's real benefits from that, in that you can use far less turbines, but they are taller and therefore more noticeable on the horizon. But that's an issue for the planning system to have to develop and work out. As we go further south and west, it will become less of an issue, particularly with floating, because the constraints of close to shore become less a factor. And particularly as we go at scale, the really big scale off the west coast, the really strong wind resources on that kind of northwestern part of the island, it is much deeper waters, and as we develop larger sites further out to see, that'll become less of an issue. But we still need to get the maritime planning right. My department, the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications, has repurposed what was the Petroleum Affairs Division, which would operated real expertise in licensing waters for exploration has been repurposed for licensing and permitting for offshore wind development instead. And also looking at offshore wave, particularly as a further complementary technology, probably later in development. It's a long-term investment, it always has been, but there is complementary benefits in terms of the wind system comes in. I mentioned earlier, the wind comes with it. The wave system comes typically several hours or even a day or two later, and therefore you get a balancing capability. I go back to that North Seas Offshore Grid Initiative, which we signed 10 years ago. It's still going strong. In fact, it's picking up now in terms of importance. At the European Council, there's real recognition that this is one of Europe's key infrastructure investment projects. We're planning something like 300, like for Ireland, just 30 gigawatts. And to give people a sense of scale, that's probably about 35 if you include the East Coast. That's probably about 7 times the amount of electricity we're consuming at the moment. So it's going to be a huge balancing act how we manage that. It will significantly see a lot of industrial development, in my mind, moving to the west, northwest, moving close to our ports, Cork, Shannon, Waterford, Killybegs, Derry, Belfast, close to where the power will come ashore. There's a real advantage in putting infrastructure or industry demand for that power close to the source of landing, and that will help in balanced regional development. But it will also involve us on a balancing capability, involve building much more significant interconnection with our neighbouring markets. This will not work if we go it alone. We have to work with the UK, regardless of what Brexit delivers. It makes no sense for Britain for this to work as an isolated island, and makes even less sense for us to, as the island of an island, to be cut off from the UK, or to see them cut off from the rest of Northwest Europe. We will build further interconnection cables with the UK. We have Airgrid or advanced planning with a new cable with France. And that, in my mind, is only the start of this supergrid. This these new cables, HVDC cables, are about that size, and they can carry up to 1-2 gigawatts of power, transmit them long distances with very low losses. The cabling technology is evolving so that you can move power backwards and forwards, and it's a much more dynamic grid system. Airgrid is going to have a key role in the transmission, designing, building, operating, and owning this transmission grid, with a real public gain from having that. We also, Ciarán, you're absolutely right, we have to ensure there's community involvement. It's a difficult thing on offshore wind because the scale is huge. We're talking billions on any one project. But we're working with our government colleagues around mechanisms where we can get community involvement in that. There's some examples in Denmark and elsewhere, which I think are useful pointers in how we can integrate community involvement, ownership, as well as benefit from these large scale projects. This is all has to be done in the next year. So we've a very busy year ahead of us. We're on track. It's very tight timeline. So the legislation, the Maritime Planning Bill is going to be a critical piece of legislation to get through it all. The North Seas Offshore Grid, the European legislative, the Fit for 55 package backs this up, everything we're doing, as I see. We're going to have to get flexibility from the Commission, Ciarán. I'll be honest, some of the issues around, it's very interesting talking to my colleague Claude Turmes, who I've worked on this for ages. We agree. We're also going to have to get flexibility from the Commission in terms of, because particularly the integration with the grid and the ordering of projects and the optimization of our onshore grid as well. So we want to minimize the amount of new grid that we have to build. So we're going to have to get flexibility from the Commission on that, on how state aid rules apply and so on. But this is all doable. The financing is moving into this area. The US government's commitments last week to match, in a sense, our climate ambition targets this is going to be a huge US area of development, as well as in Europe, as well as in Asia. So this is the technology everyone's investing in. It will be matched likely with the conversion to hydrogen in ports like Shannon, Cork, Waterford, and so on, and that as an alternative fuel to help us meet our climate targets. We won't meet our climate targets without offshore wind. We have to do it sensitively. We have to do it with real community gain in mind. But this is for the country. This is our economic huge part of our economic strategy for recovery, for security, for sustainability, and we are well placed in my mind. We are good at this, integrating renewables. We're not going to do it at real scale.
Eamon, thank you so much for your contribution, and certainly you have a busy period ahead with a lot of legislation coming down the track within the next few months, if not weeks, I think. So thank you for your contribution. I'll move on now, and we are also honoured to have with us Matthieu Ballu, Director General for Renewable Energy Unit within the European Commission. So Matthieu works in the team that is in charge of defining and steering the EU's renewable energy policy at the European Commission's Directorate General for Energy. Matthieu, you're very welcome to join us this morning. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Ciarán. Good morning, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be here. Indeed, I'm working on renewable energy policy in the European Commission, and also having a specific look at Ireland and Irish policies. I would like to give you a bit of a European perspective to add to this discussion on Ireland's ambition on offshore energy. I think if I have three main messages to share today, the first one is that clearly if and when that Irish ambition outlined by Minister Ryan right now materializes, Ireland will really be a European and global champion on renewable energy, and that really has to be said. It's extremely inspiring to hear that. The second one is that it's a very challenging plan. The decade is short, and there are lots of challenges to that ambition, but most of these challenges are shared by most European countries. So there's a lot to learn from others as well, and that's my third message really. In these discussions, it's really useful to exchange experience with others. To start, let me remind you a bit how far we've come, because 2020 was the first year of reckoning. You know, I mean, in 2008, we discussed the world's first binding targets for renewable energy. We set a 20% binding target for the EU, which we did achieve. All our numbers show that last year. For electricity only, last year, 38% of our electricity came from renewable energy. If you look at where we were 10 years ago when niche, it's spectacular. But it's not enough. With our 2050 ambitions and the increased 2030 EU climate ambition that comes from that, our 55% climate target, we need to double that share of renewables in all sectors, not only electricity. In a way, electricity has been the easy part so far, but also in heating and cooling, in transport, etc. We're working on all that. We are currently revising, proposing revisions to all EU legislation, of course, and there's a specific role of offshore in that work, which I will explain. Offshore is still really a very minor part of the EU's energy mix at the moment. We have about 12 gigawatts installed at the end of last year, EU-wide. We're still at the very beginning of that story, but our target in the EU offshore strategy adopted last year is to reach 60 gigawatts by 2030. So we want to multiply by 5 the installed offshore capacity over a decade. That's a huge challenge. It's a regulatory challenge, a challenge in terms of investment, of course. It's an industrial challenge. It will require moving from a strictly national to a sea basin dimension. Of course, we need that the grid moves in parallel, and it's not only an energy agenda. It's really about the development of a European-wide economy supporting that offshore value chain. And really what I hear about the Irish ambition and the policies and the trajectory for development really fits very well in that European perspective. Not only in terms of offshore wind, but in terms of the evolution of your energy system and the very integrated vision that you have, the fact that Airgrid is already able to integrate very high amounts of variable renewables generation, and that whole transformation is really being planned ahead. Now, if I look at the various challenges of that transformation, the first one is really the pace required and the bottlenecks to address, to avoid if we really want to be there in 10 years' time. Because the 10 years, the 2030 is just the first step, but if we don't manage to ramp up sufficiently fast, we have no chance of remaining on the trajectory to 2050. So on the first aspects of that acceleration, the EU has put in place rules to help investors, to create confidence, to help governments. For instance, on support schemes, it's great to see that the new renewable electricity support scheme is in place, that specific auctions will be put in place for offshore. We have put in place rules across the EU to encourage also, well, to create, let's say, similar conditions in all countries so that investors can more easily adapt what they've been doing in one country to the other one. On permitting, I know that's a challenge for the wind everywhere. There are also EU-wide rules that have to be enacted this year in all countries to accelerate, simplify the permitting procedures, and the implementation of these rules will be very important. But at the same time, as mentioned by Eamon Ryan, you also have to maintain a balance. Permitting has to be fast and efficient, but the coexistence with all other sectors, the remaining within environmental boundaries, the local acceptance are just as important and are just as able to stop the whole process. We're really talking about an enormous new use of marine space. This is why the European Union has been promoting maritime spatial planning, including cross-border, to really anticipate and avoid these conflicts. There again, as already mentioned by Eamon Ryan, the role of energy communities and actively engaging with local communities is essential. It's indeed more complex in the case of large projects like offshore, where it's more difficult to get people to feel directly connected to it. We're really interested in the new design of the renewable electricity support scheme and the fact that it includes some community dimension in the support schemes. Then the other challenge is an industrial challenge. The manufacturing capacity, the skills to deliver those huge projects, those immense machines, and the maintenance ships, etc. So we're working very closely with the industry. We have a clean energy industrial forum that is in place to really exchange with all renewable industrial sectors and identify where we can help. There are very different needs, of course. The wind industry and the various ocean energy technologies are very different, but we are really working with them, try to identify common issues and also to promote that industry globally. I would just quickly mention that we are talking about, of course, the transformation of the whole power system. So clearly, it's not only about generation, it's about anticipating the energy system of the future. So in the EU, we adopted a strategy on energy system integration, which is about anticipating that change to a more decentralized system with a very high share of variable renewables, where Many more sectors are converted to the direct use of electricity. You will need more generation, more storage, more networks for that, much more digitalization, of course, to support it. And all this is of course much more acute in an island context like Ireland. So in a way, from the EU perspective, it's very interesting to see how you're tackling these challenges and what can inspire others in the EU. Energy efficiency, I really have to mention it. Nothing of that will work out if we don't address our energy use and first make sure that we save energy wherever possible first. That's a principle enshrined now in EU law. The development of networks, something that has to happen in parallel, of course, enormous investment needs. We're working on that. We're supporting it through the Trans-European Networks policy. The Celtic Interconnector was also partly financed by the Connecting Europe facility, which drives me to my almost last point on investment. It's also very interesting for us to see the large role of power purchase agreements in the new Irish policy. It's something that the EU has promoted through the Renewable Energy Directive. We really need new ways to tap into private investment, and those PPAs are a crucial instrument for that. In the EU, we have a number of instruments, of course, that we're putting at the service of investment in renewable energy. I already mentioned the 10E policy. We have a financial mechanism, which is in a way a pool where all member states can channel money to finance EU-wide tenders for renewable energy. And of course, the recovery money, many EU member states have chosen to use it for the development of renewable energy, but also other clean energy projects. And the very last point I would like to make is to underline also how well offshore energy fits in the narrative of just transition, and how interesting it is to see again the Irish example. We are moving to a fossil fuel system to a renewables-based system, and it won't be easy for everyone. Some communities will lose their main livelihoods. In Ireland, you have the specific context of peat on the one hand, and of coal on the other hand. It's very interesting to see the planned developments around Money Point in particular. And the great work that you and the SEAI are doing with renewable energy communities as well, to really ensure that local communities reap the benefits of that clean energy transition. I'll stop here, but I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. Thanks a lot.
Matthieu, thank you very much. And my apologies for bumping you up to the post of Director General. I think Dita Juul-Jorgensen may well not approve, but your contribution has been a fantastic addition to our deliberations today. So we now move on to our first panel, a discussion of how can Ireland succeed. And on that panel, we have Eddie O'Connor of Mainstream, Peter Lafloy from RWE, Alice Whittaker of Philip Solicitors, Liam Lacey of the Irish Maritime Development Office, and Mark Foley from Airgrid. So I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion. I will ask you to keep time, and I will nudge you when you're coming to the end of your contribution. So I might just now introduce our first speaker, Eddie O'Connor. Eddie is, of course, a renowned entrepreneur and leader in the renewable energy sector globally. He founded Mainstream Renewable Power in 2008 and was chief executive until 2017. And he now is in the position of executive chairman. Eddie, over to you. And Eddie, I think you're still on mute. And Eddie, I'll give you a few moments more to unmute. And if you're not there now, you are Eddie. Welcome.
I think I've unmuted now. Yes, and thank you very much indeed, Ciarán.
Not at all, Eddie. Would you mind turning on your camera if you can? We're on briefly, but I think you turned yourself off again.
Did I? I must be too excited, Ciarán, at the prospects of.
You're there now. Welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, and sorry for that mess up. Just let me say thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to speak at this great symposium that you've organised, and also I want to congratulate our minister, who we've just heard from, on the incredible achievements that he's made in getting the government to commit to this green future that we're actually talking about. And the issues I would like to cover can be divided into short and long term. The short term concerns the release of free power to be had from the Irish Sea. The longer term is about turning the comparative advantage Ireland enjoys by virtue of its geographic position into competitive advantage for the Irish nation. In the short term, we're talking about supplying Ireland with green electricity. In the longer term, we're talking about supplying Europe with a goodly proportion of its supply of green electricity. The organisational components we have to put in place for the short term would be far too limited in scope to allow for the export of what Minister Ryan has just described as 7 times the electricity demand in Ireland. For both, however, we need a consenting and licensing arrangement, a lease fee taking body, and an adequate grid. Everything we do in the short term is within the power of the Government of Ireland. Most of what has to be done in the long term happens to fall within the power of the European structure. In the short term, the establishment of MARA is a good thing. However, we need interim transition measures for development to continue prior to its establishment. There's a lot of frustration about, getting meetings with people. We know they're understaffed, but we would like to see some, Minister, to see some interim transition arrangements in place. And specifically, Mainstream set out a case for the use of a design envelope. Technology is changing all the time, and what you think is the technology of today may not be the technology of 2 years' time or 3 years' time when you get your planning permission. So this is referred to as the Rochdale envelope in England and Wales. And this design envelope we'd like to see getting applied here in Ireland. And also we wonder what's sacrosanct about the 12 nautical mile limit. I mean, we own the sea halfway out to Britain, so there's higher wind speeds out there, and there's less cumulative impact and less visual intrusion. Now, one of the big topics that I want to talk about is congestion in the city of Dublin. This is happening at the transmission and distribution voltage levels. This congestion will, according to my sources, merely allow 1,500 megawatts of offshore wind to be built in the Irish Sea. This generation will have to be in the very near sea vicinity to Dublin as well. And it's a serious political issue which could derail the green agenda to which this Irish government has committed itself. The Dublin grid congestion issues affect not only the green transition, but the broader economic wealth of the state as well. We cannot locate any further data centres in the Leinster area because of grid congestion. We can't repower Dublin bus with green electricity fleet because of grid congestion. We can't commit ourselves to 100% green transport until we install a high-density, fast-charging, easily accessible charging system until the grid congestion problem is solved. And we cannot do as Claude Turmes, Minister for Energy in Luxembourg, has done, and mandate that all home heating be done by heat pumps until the grid congestion issue is solved. Now, to deal with the wider Irish transmission issue, which is out for debate at the moment, it's very simple. One of two things has to be done. We have to either bury cables in the ground, or we have to restring the existing overhead lines with bigger conductors. And to deal with the congestion problem in Dublin, we have to recognise the difficulty of burying cables in a densely built urban environment. There's a solution which Supernode has proposed to Airgrid, the ESB, and the regulator, the CRU, and this solution involves superconductivity. It has two great attributes which work in a city environment. It has a tiny footprint compared to the conventional copper-based cable solution, and it can transfer an almost infinite quantity of power from substation A to substation B. I have visited Seoul in South Korea and Essen in Germany, where this technology is in place. There's a project in planning for Munich, which will transfer 500 megawatts over a distance of 12 kilometers using superconductivity, and another in Chicago, which will move power over a distance of 4 to 5 kilometers. It will increase the resilience, the reliability, and more importantly, the capacity of Dublin to accept more transmitted power and also to mesh the distribution grid. And Minister, Supernode can offer to bring the planners and operators of the superconducting connectors to Ireland to explain the technology to the government. In the longer term, to build 30,000 to 100,000 megawatts off the western and southern coasts, we need a supergrid to be in existence to transmit power there to all points in Europe. For Ciarán in the European Parliament, this is a key concept that needs European attention. There will be some 900,000 megawatts built in the mainly northern seas at the periphery of the continent. A similar quantity of PV will be built around the Mediterranean basin. Both these systems will have to be linked up via the supergrid. We can decarbonize all energy and industrial hydrogen and ammonia using it. Now, we support the green proposal in the IEC, which will encompass all infrastructure, including offshore and onshore electricity grids. One word of caution, however. When you burn a ton of gas, you release 2.7 tons of CO2. 1 ton of coal released burns 2.8 tons of CO2. So beware of the massive, powerful gas lobby, which wants to create a network of blue hydrogen, which is 95% natural gas and 5% green hydrogen. Thanks very much indeed, Ciarán, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Eddie, and thank you for keeping to time. Some very interesting questions there, particularly around the gas end of things. And we're certainly well aware of the power and constant presence of the gas lobby in the lobbies, not in the time of pandemic, but they do find ways of getting to us on our Twitter feed or elsewhere. But very interesting technical developments there as well. So thank you very much for that, Eddie. Our next speaker is Peter Lafloy from RWE. Peter is a director of RWE Renewables Ireland. RWE Renewables, as many of you know, well, it's both one of the world's leading renewable energy companies, but unfortunately, it's also one of our leading coal and gas electricity generators as well. But Peter has extensive experience in the energy industry, having worked in engineering consultancy, project development and construction. And of course, the Dublin array is on his watch. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ciarán, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. Look, as you say, I'm here representing the Dublin Array project, and that's one of the first phase of projects. Phase 1 project will be the backbone of the offshore industry and will be a critical element of the pathway to delivering on 2030 goals and establishing the offshore industry in Ireland. As an industry, we definitely understand that there's an awful lot of work going on at a government level and in the various state agencies. And it is very clear that there's a strong recognition of the scale and benefits that offshore wind can bring to the Irish economy. But we also have to note that this work has been going on for quite a long time and that deadlines have been missed along the way. There have obviously been a number of false dawns in the industry. And while there is certainly momentum now, we definitely need to make sure that this opportunity is fully seized for the benefit of all. We've developed to date, and policy has to an extent progressed to date in a sequential manner. However, that model will not work into the future. We have been one of the most successful countries in the world in developing renewable electricity, but we are now facing into the challenge of doubling that amount of capacity in half the time. We need to recognise that the offshore industry is a global one, and that while Ireland is a market that is looking to expand significantly, it is not a large market in that global context. Look at the UK setting a target of 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, the EU of 60 gigawatts by 2030 and 300 gigawatts by 2050, and then layer in the USA, multiple large markets in APAC and other global emerging markets. So we don't necessarily have scale to ensure we attract the global supply chain here, but if we at the same time fail to act quickly and deliver on our commitments, then there is a danger that we will get left behind. And that will mean slower delivery of projects, which jeopardizes our chance of reaching targets. And it also risks that we will deliver those projects at a much higher cost than necessary. And that is in nobody's interest, including the project sponsors like RWE and Mainstream, despite what some commentators and critics might like to say. We have a batch of projects that are well advanced with established fixed technology. Floating technology is coming, but it is at an early stage and is not ready and will not deliver on our targets in the short to medium term. The current projects are in locations that make sense in terms of the energy system here. In other words, they're in the best location for connection to the grid and proximity to current demand, as well as suitable water depth and excellent wind speeds. And we have a cohort of project sponsors who have committed to the Irish market and are only waiting to invest very significant amounts of money if the conditions are right. So these are deliverable projects now, if only we can get those conditions right soon, because time is fast running out for 2030. So what do we need? We need a coherent and robust consenting and leasing process that allows certainty around risks and delays, but also delivers transparency to the public and that the state is benefiting appropriately and that this benefit is not coming at a cost in terms of the environment and so on. Eddie has mentioned this already, and I know Alice will go into the legislation in more detail, so I won't labour on these issues. But there are 2 points to make. One is that the allocation of seabed rights in the future must be done in such a way that it is the developers with the competence, experience, and long-term commitment. In other words, those who will develop, build, and operate the wind farms in their lifetime that are mandated and not just to the highest bidder. Facilitating speculation is not the way to deliver a long-term sustainable industry. The second point on consenting is that there is the current situation on licensing for projects to undertake surveys for preparation for the various steps that are required. The system is entirely congested and it currently is not working well. We know that it will be replaced by MAP legislation, but projects need to be on site now to survey and to be able to gather information on the sites in order to complete updated environmental assessments and to prepare for the forthcoming auction. Second thing we need is a grid system that is an enabler rather than the limiter on the progress of the industry. Eddie's mentioned this or discussed this in some depth, and his vision is a compelling one. And again, I'm not going to go over what's covered here, and I'm sure Mark will talk about it further. But it is worth noting 1 point on grid. It's clear from the various studies that have been undertaken previously, including the East Coast study, the ongoing studies that Airgrid are working on now, and the work that fed into the Airgrid's Shaping Our Electricity Future consultation, that there are a substantial number of no-regret system upgrades that can be delivered, and that those will have a significant bearing on the development of offshore wind for 2030, and on unblocking the existing system, as Eddie has noted. These have to be prioritised and urgently progressed in order to marry with the timelines necessary for offshore wind. Projects cannot progress efficiently if they do not have certainty when the system can be ready for them, and projects will not progress if they are facing significant uncertainty as well as technical and financial consequences of excessive levels of local constraint and system curtailment that are expressly not in their control. The third thing is finding an appropriate balance between utilising local and global supply chain that recognise, firstly, that it is in everyone's interest to see as much local content and resource as possible used on projects, but also recognising that the local supply chain is at an early stage of development. There are clear benefits, as we all know, from maximising the number of jobs in the local industry and the positive impact that will have on public acceptance for the industry. Wind Energy Ireland produced a report last year that estimated a potential investment of up to 19 billion for 3.5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. Our target is now 5 gigawatts, so you can pro-rata that figure up. But we also have to be clear that we need to tap into the existing global supply chain in order to maximise our chances of delivering quickly and minimising the cost of development. And finally, we need a route to market system that recognises the impact that current and future uncertainty in consenting, grid and supply chain will have on how projects are able to prepare for the RES auction. Phase 1 projects will still be in a consenting process when they submit auction bids next year, and given the pace of the progress now, they will likely face challenges from certain quarters. This is likely to be an extended process. This entails a significant expenditure for the auction without the certainty of the outcome of a consent process, which is clearly not a problem because we are in that process, but it has its consequent impacts. As I've said before, there's an awful lot of uncertainty around the methodology of grid delivery. We hope that will be cleared up very soon with the government decision on the grid delivery modeling, but there is also a huge amount to do once that decision is made and when projects are submitting bids for finalizing connection methodologies, confirming consent impacts, and understanding the implications of those connections on project costs. And also the supply chain context is uncertain, and it cannot be left to the industry to make the market on their own. If that is left to happen, then the supply chain will miss out. Government needs to recognise that decisions need to be made to create the conditions that the supply chain can develop. All of this mandates that an auction design is developed that recognises all of this context and allows risk to be allocated to the entity that is best able to manage the consequences, and also recognises the interdependent nature of all of the development steps that projects have to go through. In particular, I would question the current direction of travel in terms of pay-as-bid auction structure. While there is precedent for this structure in other countries, this is only in the case in markets where risk is not squarely and fully on the developer, as it appears to be in Ireland currently. That's all I have to say for now, Ciarán. So thank you very much again for the opportunity, and look forward to taking questions later on.
Peter, many thanks for your contribution. Some very interesting points there about trying to deter speculation and make sure that the permitting system is fit for purpose. Our next speaker is Alice Whittaker. Alice joined Philip Lee in Solicitors in 2004 and was appointed as a partner in 2007. Her career focus since qualifying as a lawyer in 2001 has been on the provision of strategic advice to clients operating in the environmental, energy, infrastructure, housing, climate action and marine sectors. Alice, I feel I know you well from Twitter over the years, but I'm really looking forward to your insights on the challenges and opportunities for ocean energy. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Ciarán. By my calculation, there are about 26 days remaining in the current Oireachtas term before the summer recess. The current moratorium, if I can call it that, on offshore renewable energy projects that's been in place since about 2012 or 13 will remain in place until the new consenting legislation is enacted. Until the new Marine Area Planning Bill is published, we all remain somewhat in the dark as to when and under what conditions the moratorium will be lifted. I do a lot of work in the High Court and the Supreme Court, and all of the judges that I have appeared before have variously described the existing planning and environmental legislative regime as an untidy patchwork and confusing almost to the point of being impenetrable to the public, which is not really in line with Aarhus in terms of public access to justice. So the existing planning legislation is full of pitfalls, it's quite unclear, and it's very inflexible. And in my view, the Marine Area Planning Bill must avoid this same fate. In Philip Lee, when we're working on projects, we rely on multidisciplinary teams to solve complex projects and complex problems. The state in the offshore area, I think, recognises the need for a multi-departmental and multi-agency approach, particularly where so many different bodies are involved in developing policy and plans. I do think that the state can and should do better in seeking the views of relevant experts outside of the state entities and agencies much earlier in the process to avoid the kind of pitfalls that we have seen in other legislative areas. I think earlier publication of the draft legislation would be most helpful. All of the attendees at this webinar, and I've had a look at the attendee list before I joined, have an enormous contribution to make. There's huge collective expertise. A public and private partnership approach is needed, I think. At the start of any PPP project, my colleagues in Philip Lee's projects team prepare a risk allocation matrix. Each identified project risk is contractually allocated to the partner best placed to deal with it. This de-risks the project and avoids delays. With respect to the overall national offshore renewable energy project, the state de-risks projects by setting the policy and writing, for example, the National Marine Planning Framework, to which decision makers and others must have regard. The state may also proceed under this framework and the new legislation to designate zones and adopt spatial and sectoral plans where required. It has to be remembered that the National Marine Planning Framework is not in itself a spatial plan per se. It doesn't designate zones for development. It is at its heart a plan to make more plans. The Marine Strategy Framework Directive and the EU's Biodiversity Strategy require Ireland to expand our existing network of marine protected areas. I don't believe it's legally correct to say that projects are premature pending the completion of that process, but at the same time, the development of projects must not interfere with the designation and protection of sites. A collaborative approach is needed. Environmental NGOs and state agencies with expertise in the marine area and developers and decision makers and regulators can, if they are adequately resourced and required to work collaboratively, they can ensure that projects are appropriately sited and designed so as to minimize biodiversity impacts, even in advance of the designation of marine protected areas. The Minister recently described the new National Marine Planning Framework as a handrail for decision makers and developers, and I think that description is apt. Plan-led development, which is generally considered good policy, does not actually require railway tracks to be laid down from which deviation is impossible. Design innovation can and should be facilitated through a flexible design approach in accordance with EU law. There's plenty of case law that supports design flexibility and an iterative process through the consenting process. The state could reduce project risks further by adopting and regularly updating technical standards and guidance to assist decision makers, and subjecting that guidance to strategic environmental assessment and appropriate assessment early in the design stage. The state can and should also resource all of the relevant agencies to engage with and guide developers earlier in the design process. All too often, I advise developers who are unable to get feedback from relevant agencies prior to submitting a planning application, even though that is precisely what they are required to do. Organising and managing and centrally engaging with affected third parties, such as fisheries, would also de-risk projects for developers who are not as well placed to engage with those sort of interests on a case-by-case basis. This can lead to delays, litigation, compensation claims that are hard to justify. The Marine Area Regulatory Authority, or MARA, will be given the role of assessing and determining site surveys. This is actually great news. I outlined in submissions to the Pre-Legislative Scrutiny Committee that survey work is generally temporary and transient and not carried out on an exclusive basis, and is therefore not akin to development requiring planning permission. But how long will MARA take to be established, not just legislatively, but operationally too? And what happens in the meantime? Prospective developers currently cannot apply for consent to carry out surveys in the EEZ beyond the 12 nautical mile limit. And even within the 12 nautical mile limit, administrative barriers exist due to a backlog of applications that went unprocessed over the last 2 years. Transitional measures will be required under the existing foreshore legislation and Continental Shelf Acts if the medium to longer term pipeline of potential projects are to be realised within the necessary timeframes. Offshore projects have a long lead time. So if such measures are not put in place, prospective developers may well move their investment capital elsewhere. I'd like to thank you, Ciarán, and your team in particular for giving us this opportunity to have this valuable discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice, for a huge contribution to unraveling the legislative and regulatory challenges that we face. I think it is a sober assessment of what needs to be done. And I think that last point about the long lead-in time is hugely important in the context of our discussions today. So our next speaker is Liam Lacey, a director of the Irish Maritime Development Office, and formerly worked with the Irish Continental Group as managing director of its container and terminal division. He has extensive experience in shipping, chartering, and port development. Liam, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Ciarán. Good morning to you and good morning, everybody. Ciarán, may I start by thanking you for the invitation to this morning's symposium. and also for your leadership in putting the event together. As you said, I'm Director of the Irish Maritime Development Office. And
Liam, can I just ask if you can tilt your camera down slightly? Sure. We're just catching the top of your head. That's much better. Thank you.
I'm trying to save you from the full picture of my face, but now you have it. The Irish Maritime Development Office's role is in the title. We're responsible for developing our maritime industry. In relation to offshore renewable energy, I am hugely enthused and optimistic for the future in terms of what can be achieved. It's exceptionally important at this time that the momentum that's being built behind Ireland's offshore renewable energy ambitions is kept going. I can tell you that our ports are keenly interested in playing their part in the rollout of the industry and ready to deliver for offshore renewable energy in precisely the same way as they have delivered for other sectors of the Irish economy in the past. Through periods of unprecedented growth, particularly since the early 90s, Irish ports have provided the infrastructure needed to facilitate economic growth. Irish ports have delivered the infrastructure that is capable of handling some of the world's largest ferries, some of the world's largest cruise vessels. They have underwritten the development of our container trade through investment in new port facilities, allowing bigger and more efficient vessels to be used in this particular trade. And in turn, that has allowed terminal operators to invest in more efficient machinery and equipment. Within port estates, infrastructure has been put in place to facilitate the handling of liquid bulk and break bulk and dry bulk materials. Currently, there are 3 important developments underway in Dublin, Cork, and Shannon Foynes, which will secure the future of capacity in our ports network. There are also projects planned for upgrade and expansion in ports like Rosslare, Galway, Waterford, Drogheda, and Greenore. Our ports are responsive, they are agile, and most of all, they are capable of meeting the demands of their stakeholder groups. If evidence for that was required, I would ask you to have regard for what has happened in the last year or two as our ports met the challenges of COVID-19 and Brexit and maintained connectivity for Irish importers and exporters with all important markets. Looking to the future and what the vision could be, the word transformative is often used and abused and is hackneyed, I suppose. But in the case of offshore renewable energy, I think that the word is absolutely appropriate for a number of reasons. With this resource, we are capable of addressing the security of future energy supply. We are capable of reducing carbon emissions. We are capable of creating jobs in remote regions where the natural resources exist. So offshore renewable energy has an attractive byproduct, which is regional development. We are capable of securing the future of regional ports by creating the infrastructure in those ports to facilitate offshore renewable energy development initially, but then leaving a legacy of infrastructure that can be used for mainstream port activities in the future. We are capable of developing a supply chain around the offshore renewable energy industry that will result in high quality jobs. This is an area in which Enterprise Ireland is already deeply involved. We are capable of becoming exporters of clean energy. We're capable of producing hydrogen using wind energy that will have multifarious uses in the future in transport and other industries. And lastly, and very importantly, we are capable of using offshore renewable energy to contribute to the recovery of the Irish economy as we try to put the suppressive effects of COVID and Brexit behind us. Offshore renewable energy is one of those industries that affords us an opportunity to build back better, to borrow a phrase from Joe Biden's presidential campaign. If all of that doesn't constitute something that's transformative, then I don't know what transformative means. What has to be done to enable us to make progress, and particularly from a port's perspective? In 2018, the IMDO produced an update of the IPORES report. This report looked at the preparedness of Irish ports to support the rollout of the ORE industry in this country. In order to make progress on port infrastructure, we identified 3 necessary steps. These have been referred to already, Ciarán, so I will move quickly over them. The legislative, regulatory and consenting framework needs to be in place. I accept that significant progress is being made in that area that Minister Ryan referred to it earlier and previous speakers in terms of MARA, in terms of what's happening with the National Planning Framework, in terms of the Maritime Area Planning Bill and the consultation that's underway to create marine protected areas. All of this is really, really important. And while it represents progress, it is clear that none of these measures can come soon enough. We need to get them done as quickly as we possibly can. So we should continue to cheer those who are trying to bring about, cheer on those who are trying to bring about these changes. They are undertaking important and difficult work. Secondly, we recommended that the energy industry should engage in a meaningful way with our ports. What's happening at the moment, if I may say so, reminds me somewhat of the ballroom of romance. We have would-be dancers circling the dance floor, but not actually asking the question. And we need that process to proceed at speed. And thirdly, we need the development of port infrastructure to go ahead. The development of port infrastructure has been difficult and slow in the past. If we are capable of speeding up that process, it will be an advantage to us. I am not suggesting for a moment that we take shortcuts, but we should aim to proceed at speed. The competitive environment is difficult. As pillar coordinators for the ports pillar in the Atlantic strategy, we're doing a lot of work with other countries like France, Spain, and Portugal. It's clear that they are hugely interested in offshore renewable energy, and that the same applies in Northern Europe in countries like Denmark, the Netherlands, Poland, Germany. Ireland won't find it easy to compete in this international industry, so we have to take full advantage of all of the capabilities that we have. If we can make the planning process more responsive, it's going to be a competitive advantage to us, and I would urge that that takes place. One final point relates to coordination. It's been dealt with already. I saw the coordination that was present in the action plan for jobs work really well, where there was a degree of centralized control, but it didn't inhibit relevant departments from acting autonomously within their departmental mandate. And I think that that's an important point. So I would offer those views as sort of conversation pieces, Ciarán. And again, thank you for the invitation to speak this morning.
Thanks, Peter. Most useful. I mean, this theme of joined up thinking and involving all stakeholders comes up time and time again. And I've no doubt it will be echoed by our final speaker, this panel, Mark Foley of Airgrid. Mark joined Airgrid as Group Chief Executive in almost 2 years ago in June, almost 3 years ago in June 2018, having held the role of Managing Director of Land Solutions in Quilcha since January 2016. And previous to that, Mark was Managing Director of Quilcha Enterprise. So Mark, you're very welcome to the discussion, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Over to you.
The dreaded mute.
There you are. You're with us.
Months later, I get caught by the mute thing again. It's a killer. Listen, good morning. Thank you, Ciarán, and your party colleagues for the opportunity to contribute to this important event. I'm going to talk to 4 things: bit of background, Airgrid's purpose, Airgrid's strategy, and why offshore is so important. Look, we live in extraordinary times. The ongoing pandemic continues. 15 months on, 3 million people dead across the globe, and a horrible human cost that the world has borne. But hope's on the horizon in the form of the vaccine program and the gradual opening up of society. So for the first time, I think in a long time, we're feeling upbeat. On an equally positive note, the newly elected US President Joe Biden has rejoined the Paris Accord. He recently called together 40 world leaders to discuss a concerted approach to dealing with climate change. And he announced, frankly, a breathtaking commitment on behalf of the United States to reduce CO2 emissions by 50% by 2030. So big change from the Trump regime. I think there's a real sense of anticipation about UN COP26. Somebody said recently to me, is this our do or die moment? I think it is. But I'm also really proud to say the Government of Ireland has just passed a landmark climate action and low carbon development bill, which will commit to a 7% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions per annum between now and 2030, double the previous ambition from 2019. And I think it's a staggering commitment, and it equally equates to an overall reduction of 50% by 2030. Central to the government's ambition is the role of electricity, or we call it the power system here in Airgrid, and a commitment to transition Ireland's power system to one that will deliver 70% of all electricity from renewable sources by 2030. Why am I confident today? I'm confident that we can achieve this because we have a track record of delivery, as evidenced by the recently published numbers for 2020, which confirmed the world-leading statistic that the RESI number for Ireland for 2020 was 43%. Above the expectation set back by Eamon and his colleagues in the coalition government back in 2008. We have the natural resources, we have the ecosystem for delivery, we have the technology, and the funding model is very well proven. So I'm confident as we talk today. Airgrid's purpose, just for those who aren't familiar with, say, we launched our strategy in 2019 and we set about a new purpose for our company, and that is to transform the power system for future generations. Why transform? Because it's a revolution and it's not an evolution, such is the scale of the challenge. The power system, because this is a highly complex, interdependent ecosystem, and all parts of it have to work in harmony. And future generations, because frankly, if we fail to deliver in the next decade, then our children and our grandchildren will face the consequences of our failure. We recently launched Shaping Our Electricity Future on the 8th of March. This is the biggest and most far-reaching consultative process in our history, and I would argue ever undertaken by a state company. It's about finding the optimum pathway to 2030 for both renewables generation and for the grid, which hooks everything together. We've put 4 options into play with really superb supporting data, and I encourage all of you on this call and those far and wide, please engage on this really important process in Ireland's response to climate change. We'll complete this process in June and we will publish a roadmap in the autumn. And I'm delighted so far with the maturity and engaging nature of the response we've got right across the universe of stakeholders throughout the country, and indeed the press, and including the political system. Our primary goal in our strategy is to lead the Ireland's electricity sector on sustainability and decarbonisation. And we've 6 major deliverables underpinning that big ambition. One is we need to connect 10,000 megawatts of renewables over the next decade, twice which was being delivered in the last 20 years. So we've got to do twice in 10 years what we did in 20 years. This will include more onshore wind, of which we're world leaders, solar PV, which is a new addition and a complementary technology to onshore wind. And crucially, we need to deliver 5,000 megawatts of offshore wind in the Irish Sea from a baseline of practically zero. Ireland's ambition is not realisable without offshore wind. And we're very fortunate to have the potential to harness not just the 5,000 megawatts in the Irish Sea, but more than 30 gigawatts offshore as we look to Ireland's opportunity in the next few decades. Secondly, we must massively increase our performance at delivering new and upgraded infrastructure. And I've heard that coming loud and clear from other participants. By performance, I mean the timeline from identifying the need to delivering the best solution. And I hope we're delivering evidence of this new approach as manifested in recent announcements by Airgrid on underground cable solutions in both the Greater Dublin area and North Connaught. We're listening to people. We need to deliver the Celtic interconnector between Ireland and France, as well as facilitating other strategic projects in this space, including the proposed Green Link interconnector between Ireland and the UK. Interconnection is vital for security of supply and to facilitate higher volumes of renewables on our island system. We need to design, develop and implement the necessary technical solutions to enable the power system to operate at 95% SNSP by 2030. SNSP is the complex acronym for really the amount of variable renewable generation that we can handle on the power system at a given point of time. We recently signed off on 75% SNSP, a first in the world. We've plans to deliver 75% by the end of this year. And a small secret, we hit 73% at times over this weekend as we're embarking on new trials to achieve the 75% objective. Every 1% beyond 70% is increasingly difficult to deliver as we push against the boundaries of physics. The market must also evolve in concert with the power system, as we must be able to attract public and private investment to support this transition, whether it be in system services or low carbon gas or new technologies during the transition period. Finally, our last strategic goal is we want to be an exemplar company in how we conduct ourselves, how we operate our business, and how we walk the talk as in our ultimate objective to deliver net zero in our own business. Finally, why is offshore wind so important for Ireland? Firstly, we have an exceptional natural resource whose time, I believe, has truly arrived. It can and it will deliver renewables at extraordinary scale with extraordinary capacity factors, thus leading to highly competitive prices. Thirdly, the technology is both proven and continues to advance at phenomenal speed. And we in Ireland can transplant this proven technology and expedite its deployment with very low risk in pursuit of our big ambition for the power system and the subsequent electrification of heat and transport. The best companies in the world are now active in the Irish Sea in developing a range of projects, all of which can and must be delivered by 2030. We, as the TSO, along with other key stakeholders, including the DSO and the regulator, we've worked with the government on the development of optimum models for the planning and delivery of offshore wind off the coast of Ireland over the next few decades. And we as a nation have a gilt-edged opportunity to get it right from the very first offshore project, leveraging the expertise and the experience of other countries who've been pioneers and are now world leaders in this space. And we expect a government announcement shortly on what this future model is going to look like. Finally, Ireland's opportunity in offshore wind doesn't stop at our vision for a net zero economy powered by green electricity, but it also offers us the potential to be world leaders in a number of different domains. We can be an exporter of raw renewable energy to Europe. We can create green hydrogen as a substitute for gas in our new net zero economy. And we can also look at exporting energy intensive value added products, such as data, which is at the core of 21st century business and social life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. You must have a previous life as a parliamentarian, because I think you said finally 3 times, which is a common trait certainly in parliamentary assemblies. But on a more serious note, I was so enthused to hear the head of the Irish Grid talk about how COP26 is a do or die moment, and also say that we need a revolution, not evolution, because the changes that we are proposing are so significant. I'm conscious of time and we've gone a bit over, so I will hurry through in order to allow time for a discussion at the end. And I might bring in first my friend and colleague, Jutta Paulus, who is a colleague in the Greens European Free Alliance and a fellow member of the European Parliament who sits on the ITRE, on the Energy Committee in the European Parliament. Jutta, like myself, has been in the European Parliament for the last two years. And Jutta is at the cutting edge in Germany of the transformative policies that we need in the field of energy. And she is the Greens rapporteur on the Parliament's work on harnessing the potential of offshore renewable energy. Jutta, maybe you can tell us a little bit about this and about developments in offshore energy in Germany. And we have about 5 minutes, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you very much, Ciarán, for these kind words. And sorry that I'm sitting here with a mask, but I'm in the DB lounge in Frankfurt main station because it's a green week and I'm around a bit. Well, As you said, I'm working on the offshore strategy in the Parliament, in the Industry Committee, also in the Transport Committee. And I have been following previous files that were focusing on the impact on fisheries by wind farms. You have already said so, we will not achieve climate neutrality without rapidly scaling up the deployment of offshore energy. And you in Ireland have even more potential than we in Germany do, because the North Sea is rather a battleground, so to speak, because a lot of countries neighboring to the North Sea, of course, want to harvest this offshore potential. And for this, we need a very good maritime spatial planning in order to do everyone justice and to leave sufficient space also for biodiversity and fisheries. So the situation in Ireland is, I think, a lot better. In Germany, we have, as said, the problem that we need the spatial planning, and the negotiations with fellow member states are pretty good, but could also be better, especially could run more smoothly and rapidly. In Germany, there's a lot of concerns when it comes to marine biodiversity, and I expect it to be the same in Ireland also. But as we have been deploying offshore for quite some years now, there are already experiences how the impact on marine biodiversity can be minimized. Of course, you will always have species like sea swallows, or I don't know the correct English word. There are several birds that are extremely disturbed by offshore wind farms. And of course, we have to make sure that we don't put too much pressure on them. They are already affected by climate change, by a declining nutrition situation due to the marine species wandering closer to the pole because the ocean is warming. But projects in Germany and also in Denmark have shown that preserving marine biodiversity and deploying offshore wind farms are not necessarily contradictory, because you can, during building the offshore wind farm, you can protect species like whales or dolphins by those bubble curtains so that their hearing will not be impaired. And of course, you have to make sure that the areas where you put the wind farms are not the ones where the migrating birds are going through. In this file, offshore wind and fisheries, I have had a lot of contact with NGOs and also with fishermen and their associations. And I think the crucial point is that you have to engage in conversation and debate very early in order to make sure that everyone's concerns are heard and that everyone is being taken seriously. There are also projects in the UK where the fishermen were taken in from the very beginning, and at the end of the day, a good solution was found for all. And I'm looking forward to your questions. I would not like to talk too long because, as said, I unfortunately have another appointment coming up, and there might be more questions to what I have said right now, or maybe also to other effects. Thanks.
Jutta, that was fantastic. You came through loud and clear, and I think you touched on many of the issues that we've been discussing and will continue to discuss. So I'll keep on going as we segue from one panel to another, from how Ireland can succeed to the broader issue of getting the balance right. So on our second panel, we now have Patricia Comiskey from SEAI, Vincent Kelly from Birdwatch Ireland, and Oisin Coughlin from Friends of the Earth. And then if I keep us back on time, we'll have an opportunity for some questions afterwards. So I might now move on to Patricia Comiskey from the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. And Patricia is the Programme Manager for Ocean and Offshore Energy. She has a background in marine biology and environmental consenting, and has worked for 20 years primarily on marine-related policy development, and has been with SEAI for just over 10 years. Patricia, you're very welcome.
Thanks a million, Ciarán, and thanks for the opportunity to speak. If people don't mind, I'm going to actually use a few slides to kind of to share a few of my points. Basically, just going to start the slideshow here so people could see them. Basically, when I was,
it's come up.
Great, thanks, Ciarán. When I was thinking about this session, thinking about the balance piece, I think, in fairness, a lot of the points I was planning to make have been addressed, and I suppose that's a good thing. It means we're all thinking in the same way, and I'm standing on the shoulder of giants. But just some of the points that were raised in the earlier session, the targets for the 2030 of 5 gigawatts offshore wind, that is equivalent to our peak electricity requirement in Ireland. And I mean, it would be a significant contribution if we could achieve it. The 30 gigawatts of floating offshore wind, which is a target for post-2030, would be obviously excessive of our needs, even if we look to decarbonize a significant amount of our heat sector and our transport sector. And it is likely that we'd be in a situation where we have to consider export potential for the 30 gigs. You know, when we look at the balance between economic, social, and environmental elements for offshore, I think there's certainly a lot of benefits. It's talked already about energy security this morning, enterprise development, Lacey touched on, energy exporter, Mark touched on, decarbonising of the energy system. The Minister spoke about that and meeting our EU targets. But the other areas I would see for a benefit for say from the environmental perspective is there's lots of opportunities for us to get a better understanding of of the marine environment. It's like, I think part of the challenge is the fact that there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge. And for instance, this image here is a picture that was taken this week off Mayo of a humpback whale on one of our test sites in just off Balmullet. So as a result of the projects, there's opportunities, real opportunities to start gathering information. And while I think that's a really good thing, I also think we need to consider from a national perspective how we look at that data, how we can bring it in and store it, how we can use it for projects beyond these current projects. There's also opportunities for community benefit and local jobs. And again, this was touched on by speakers earlier on. And for instance, in the community benefit piece, this is a piece that SEAI are working on quite significantly. And I think Matthieu mentioned this morning the Sustainable Energy Communities initiative that SEAI are leading on. And under that, we're looking at how to support communities and local authorities and developing community benefit funds. For instance, in the RES auction, the auction that was run earlier last year and completed this early this year, there's estimation of about 4.5 million per annum that will go towards community benefit as a result of projects that are in the system now. So again, there's opportunities for offshore projects to contribute to that. And thinking about, I mean, again, Alice touched on a lot of the policy area, and there has been significant progress made in this area. And I think Peter also mentioned that there's a huge amount of work that's happening, but and that has definitely been seen in the last 2 years. And like, for instance, there's quite a number of consultations that have been launched. And I mean, again, it gives an understanding or an indication of the commitment to getting stakeholder feedback and also engagement from the public. But I think there's also a potential for it to be quite overwhelming. I mean, certainly for those even in the system, I think the level of activity at times can feel like there's a lot of progress, but it's happening in different areas. And I think there is a need for us to pull things back in together and to understand how all of these different elements interact and impact on each other. And this is only an example of the consultations that I'm aware of, but actually, I think there was one mentioned earlier on in this discussion on the PPA, which I forgot to bring in here, and there's been others. So kind of from my perspective, and again, from listening to some of the speakers this morning, I think this is the kind of thinking that's coming out, is that I think to get the balance right, we need one plan. We need to pull together in the one direction. And again, don't want to be promoting further plans, but we need to look at how we can work more consistently and coherently together. And there is already the Offshore Renewable Energy Development Plan. It has been in place since 2014. And it's looking at how we can, it does need to be brought up to date to accommodate what is, the changes in the system, the more recent changes, but it's to look at how we could use it as a mechanism to drive our kind of a more coordinated approach in this space. And for me, these would be the key areas that we need to look at. And again, it's not about, I think there was a very good point made by Liam, it's not about, duplicating any of this work. It's about complementing this work and allowing the relevant agencies and departments to continue the work, but to ensure that there's consistency in delivery, ensure that there's coordination. And I think one plan like this would bring the key elements together. It would set set targets and timelines. And I think this is something Peter mentioned earlier on, that we're already missing some of the indicative targets that have been given. But I think we need to maybe make a more comprehensive plan of how we get to our 2030 targets and post 2030. And like, it's also important to remember that, while they're not necessarily lines in the sand, they're very much arbitrary, and we will need to make sure that we, once 2030 comes, that's not the end of the process, that we move and build beyond that. I also think that something like this will allow us to move from the project-led system that we currently have to a more plan-led system. And it will help us identify gaps and bottlenecks. I think that was addressed earlier as well. And set a pathway for emerging technologies. And for me, this is really, really important, because over the last number of years, with the real focus for offshore wind, we've lost some of the momentum that has been built in the previous 10 years to support some of our emerging technologies like wave and tidal, and now floating wind, floating solar and hydrogen. And like, there's a real need to build, for us to build pathways and plans for the development of these new and technologies, and to ensure that we are leveraging the best value that we can, because for me, this is where our enterprise development will really sit. And then finally, but far from the least important, I think actually probably one of the most important pieces for us now at this point is the public acceptance piece. We really need to build a consistent, coherent, clear messages of what we're trying to achieve in this space. How many projects are actually in the system? And I know there's lots of confusion around the number of projects, the number that are going through, say, for instance, the site investigation piece. Again, it was mentioned that these are often only indicative pieces of work, that in order to gather the information, it's not necessarily an indication of a project going ahead. So we need the public to understand what's happening in reality, and it needs to come from one consistent place. So I think in order to reduce any confusion or lack of clarity, something like this single plan is the way forward. And again, as I said, this isn't something that's new. This is something that's currently in place, but it needs some update. And there is already tools and mechanisms that sit behind this. And for instance, there will be a website that looks at, had basically pulled together all of the data and the information at the time when the plan was initially developed, and it's been maintained, and the data, the current data, any data that's collected off, say, the test sites, etc., is provided here. So the information is, the mechanism is already there, and the information is already there. And I think it's just now to look at how we can reinvigorate it and use it as a tool for our use going forward. I think that's me.
Patricia, thank you so much for that. And I think that theme of building public acceptance with coherent and clear messaging could be a conference in itself. And I think we all wrestle with that in our work as stakeholders, as developers, as civil society. I'll move on to important representatives from civil society, from the NGO world. The first is Vincent Kelly of Birdwatch Ireland, which is an enormously important civil society actor that has huge expertise in the area of birdlife and biodiversity. Vincent has worked for over 8 years on environmental advocacy within Ireland's eNGO network, working not just with Birdwatch Ireland, but also with Antashka, Swan and the Irish Wildlife Trust. So Vincent, over to you.
Hi Ciarán, thanks for having me on. I'm just going to follow Patricia's lead here and share a few slides, obviously keeping in mind the time limit. So basically, yeah, I'll be presenting here today on basically Birdwatch Ireland's concerns about offshore renewables and the need to balance our response to our biodiversity and climate crises. A lot of the points I'll be making will echo what, in particular, Alice, Patricia, and Jutta have said, and I noted concerns around legal compliance, conservation, data gaps, and public participation. First slide. So basically all life originated in the ocean, and since then the ocean has continued to support life by fulfilling essential planetary functions. The ocean supports over 90% of the habitable space on the planet and contributes almost half of annual primary production, gifting us every second breath. The ocean is a key driver of global weather patterns, and through the cycling and sequestration of carbon, the ocean helps to stabilize our climate and buffer us against climate change. A healthy ocean is essential to the well-being of society, our economies, and life on Earth. However, our treatment of the ocean does not reflect our dependence on it. Marine ecosystems are under unprecedented pressure from overfishing, climate change, and pollution. There is a serious risk that these stressors will result in tipping points, resulting in cascading impacts that could accelerate biodiversity loss and critically impair the ocean's life support system. Offshore renewables have an important role to play in Ireland's efforts to tackle our climate crisis, but they must not exacerbate our biodiversity crisis. Ireland has 31 offshore wind farm projects in the pipeline, potentially dominating the coastal seascape of the Irish and Celtic seas. There is a high overlap between proposed sites and important seabird colonies, marine habitats, and fish nursery grounds. And you can see there some online information I found of the proposed offshore wind energy sites in purple, and an example of important seabird colonies and their foraging distances around the Irish coast. Seabirds are particularly susceptible to the negative impacts of offshore wind. Such impacts include direct impacts like collision, indirect impacts like habitat loss, barrier effects, and cumulative impacts such as impacts on forage fish and marine food webs. Ireland's seabirds are under unprecedented pressure. According to Birdwatch's Ireland's recent Birds of Conservation Concern report, only one of our 24 breeding seabird species is green listed. 11 species are amber listed, and 3 species are red listed birds of high conservation concern. Despite these issues, Ireland's network of marine protected areas is totally inadequate. Only 2.3% of our marine territory is protected, and what is protected are mainly paper parks with no protection from destructive fishing practices. Ireland must achieve the EU's target of 30% MPA cover by 2030, with at least 10% highly protected. The first of Birdwatch Ireland's 3 asks for sustainable offshore renewable development are that Ireland establishes an ecologically coherent network of marine protected areas in advance of the rollout of offshore wind energy development. We are very concerned that Ireland is fast-tracking a national marine planning framework to facilitate offshore renewables, while MPA designation is being put on the long finger. Our second ask is that the scientific gaps in seabird ecology need to be addressed to inform seabird conservation and sustainable offshore renewable energy development. Gaps that must be addressed as soon as possible are data of breeding success so that changes in colony size can be understood, lack of data on prey species of seabirds, lack of data on seabird foraging areas, lack of data on seabird wintering areas, and lack of data to assess cumulative impacts. These gaps cannot be addressed in a piecemeal way during the planning process. And this is just seabirds. We also need to protect whales, dolphins, sharks, rays, and all other marine species. We need to ensure that the strategic planning of wind farms is legally compliant with Irish and EU law, as well as being underpinned by science. Wind farm sensitivity mapping is a tool that identifies important areas for seabirds, allowing planners and developers to avoid conservation conflicts at the pre-planning stage. Birdwatch Ireland have published a feasibility study on marine renewable sensitivity mapping. We now need the funding to fully develop this marine renewable sensitivity mapping tool. Those are our recommendations, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today.
Vincent, thank you so much for that. I think it really shows us the significant challenge that we have in the area of wildlife seabird protection and other species. But particularly, I noted the bird species that are red or amber listed. So there is a real challenge, particularly where there is that coincidence of both the potential sites for offshore energy and nesting, breeding, or foraging areas. So I think we have to square that circle and do it very sensitively and carefully. I'll move on to our final speaker, Oisín Coughlin from Friends of the Earth. Oisín has been Director of Friends of the Earth Ireland since 2005. He co-founded the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition in 2007 and led a 8-year campaign for a climate change law, which culminated in the passing of the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act in December 2015. But as we well know, the need for legislation in the area of climate is an ongoing saga, and there is more legislation in the pipeline. Oisín, over to you.
Thanks, Ciarán. It's good to be with you. Yes, this campaign is only going to take 4 years from 2017 to now to get the new climate law. We're getting faster. So sometime we'll also even actually cut our emissions. Hopefully that'll follow shortly. So look, I'm really happy to be with you and to talk about how we overcome the obstacles to developing our offshore wind energy resource appropriately. It doesn't come as any surprise to you to hear that I'm not an engineer, I'm not a project manager, I'm not an expert in foreshore licenses or transmission lines. For me, what I bring to this discussion is our years of working with people and our understanding that this is as much about hearts and minds as it is about those licenses and lines that we need to make this energy transition. It has to be seen and experienced as a shared societal project rather than a developer-led project. We've heard quite a lot of mention already today about the need for public acceptance. I would even slightly be wary of that phrase because it's like, yes, there is a job of persuasion, but I think it's more public engagement and public participation ultimately we need to make sure that this actually is, while developers will have a huge role, obviously, it is understood as and experienced as a shared societal project. And we don't say that just because we're woolly environmentalists who have hippie ethics. On its merits, we think it is the case that that's a better way of doing it, but actually it's simply also practical advice given our experience of wind and other large-scale infrastructure generally, that if you don't do that engagement, if you don't make room for community participation, ownership, etc., you actually make the thing you want to do as a developer or the thing you want to do as a state more difficult. You incite opposition, and that means then we have to organize this process in a way that really actually does make it open, inclusive, and participative. And before I come on to saying briefly how we should do that, I think it is worth looking back at the experience we had with onshore wind, because I think it has some useful lessons for us. Just briefly, I mean, because we obviously in Friends of the Earth support renewables, we support getting to 100% renewable electricity as soon as possible after 2030, and the target that I'm very confident we can beat of 70%. But I was out there, as others were, in the first half of the decade just gone, making the case for wind. And when, to me at least, the surprising opposition blew up at such scale, I was out there making the arguments for wind. I debated the anti-wind people on prime time in 2014 when most politicians and companies didn't want to do it. But when I met them afterwards, they asked to meet me afterwards, and I met them, and listening to them, which I hadn't been doing before in such close quarters, it was striking how much their stories came across to me in the same way as the stories from the people in Mayo had around Corrib. And it was this feeling of being powerless, of being put upon, of having corporates do things to their communities and their environment around them without their consent and without their involvement. And it made me kind of question how we had been going about our job of as we see it, of facilitating and driving this transition, and how we need to be maybe more nuanced. I think we have got better. I'll mention the Airgrid process shortly. I think their new public consultation is really excellent. But it is that feeling of powerlessness and having things done to them we have to avoid. I mean, I think, for example, that both the water protests and the anti-wind protests was much driven by the fact that people were put upon by austerity and the crash, and they couldn't stop the Anglo-Irish Bank promissory note to the bank bailout, but they could stand against that water meter there or that windmill there. It was tangible. They could vent their anger more generally at the system by opposing those things. And maybe that's why we were taken by surprise. But I would say that just because things have moved on as they have now in the 2020s, and that climate's seen differently, and the kind of imperative of climate action is more widely shared in society, the discourse in the media has changed, the discourse in our political system has changed, we shouldn't assume it'll be fine this time. I think there's a risk there, particularly if you think about how, actually I was listening to the housing debate last night. The pandemic has been almost the ultimate loss of control for a society, for all of us. And we're now beginning to get back to some form of normality. It was interesting, the political debate on housing last night. It was sort of a return to normality, and a sense that people are dying to get to grips with something they can give out about, whereas they've been too cautious about the pandemic. So we need to be careful that this doesn't become a lightning rod for public anxiety and for public issues around loss of control in other areas. It isn't always a direct causal link. It's where can I have my say. So that's why we need to build in that say into this process. I would also say one other thing that struck me in the conversation. Some of I presumed that the idea of getting lots of free wind in the Midlands and selling it to the UK would have been a winner. Getting the Brits to pay for something that was free for us. And in fact, there was this sense actually we were doing things to ourselves in order to give things to the Brits people didn't like. And I think we need to have the same. We need to tease out therefore the questions around the data centres, because they don't provide much jobs. Yes, they are wanted by US multinationals that provide other jobs, but 25% of the growth in electricity, 50% of the growth in electricity that's projected over this decade is to power new data centers, to the extent that 25% of all our electricity use will be for data centers by the end of this decade. And I think when that becomes part of the public discourse, there could be a certain sense that all these things we're doing, the new grid, the offshore wind, isn't for us, isn't for our transition, isn't for a better Irish society. It's for those multinationals that want stuff, even if it's the cloud that we all use. And it doesn't matter whether that's true or not, unless we put in place the systems to have that debate. It could derail offshore wind in there, or if not derail it, delay it in the way that onshore wind has met problems over the last decade. So the things we need to do in order to make this work: one is energy democracy at national and local level, one is good planning, shared ownership opportunities, community ownership opportunities, and community benefit. And just briefly on those 5 things, when I say energy democracy, it is about that participative process, about deciding what we're doing for ourselves, so that we're not just saying to people, do you accept this project here? You're having that broader debate in advance, or it may be in parallel, about we want to get to zero pollution. We have to get to zero pollution. Our options are, fracking, nuclear, energy efficiency, new grid, offshore wind. So it's not just the one thing in isolation. It is the choices that we face as a society are in front of people. Now, of course, it's much harder to engage people in that than it is in, do you say yes or no to a thing in my backyard? But we have to have that conversation, not just nationally, but at a scale that people can understand. And I do think the Airgrid consultation process, that my understanding is a lot of work's gone into that over the last 5 years, into their thinking in that. It's really interesting, but we're all grappling with the government's quickly put together climate action plan strategy consultation that's trying to be better than previous ones. But the Airgrid one, by contrast, people are saying, wow, this is a model of good practice. So it is really good to see that. Obviously, we need a robust and fair planning system that doesn't shut out communities and shut out individuals from having their say. We need the shared ownership opportunities, not just for onshore wind projects, but yes, for offshore too. Obviously, given the scale, we're not going to see 20% ownership by people in Ireland. I don't think of any particular offshore project, although there's 5 million people in the country. Maybe there's lots of them who want to put their pandemic savings into offshore wind. But we definitely need to make sure there is a set aside, an opportunity for people to buy in to onshore and offshore wind and solar. But when I want to speak, I know I'm conscious of time, about just a little bit, tiny more, a few lines, is around community ownership. because that's where I think makes the real difference, as in projects that are actually owned by communities, whether it's solar or local anaerobic digestion, whatever it might be, our wind. We only have one community-owned wind farm in Templederry. It took 10 years to get there. It took far too many obstacles to overcome. And even now, we've been campaigning on this for 7 years, even with all the good words from this government, it still seems quite grudging. Like there's still so many obstacles from grid connection to all of the conditionalities that's been put into the microgeneration proposal, that only if this, only if that. Whereas even if it costs a bit more for those small numbers of megawatts, it's worth that investment, that social investment, in making that really easy for people to be part of owning their own community energy. Because then, if they're part of that ownership, they'll be much more open to the big ownership by citizens and by the state and by private companies of big assets offshore or wherever that we need, and the grid changes we need to sell and move that electricity. But we still have a long way to go. So, for example, to give you one example, for the last 4 or 5 years, we have been working on solar schools. The idea of putting solar panels on schools because they're hubs in the community. It's a really way to educate both young people and their families in an exciting way. And the obstacles are extraordinary. Actually, we have some very good support from Airgrid, who sponsored some of the schools to put panels on. We ran a national competition over 2 years. But the fact that the schools still have to get planning permission to put solar panels of any size on their roofs adds to the cost and the time delay. And despite huge amounts of engagement, has been impossible to get the SAAI to just support solar panels on schools. And to the extent that we've pretty much given up on getting that change. Every politician we speak to gets the idea that every school or solar school is popular. It's a way to get everybody involved. We should be making that government policy that by 2030 at the very latest, every school is a solar school. And we should be putting in place the things that make that easy for communities to do, not relying on an NGO to kind of bang its head against a brick wall to try to make it to happen. If we can do that sort of stuff, the rest begins to follow, I think. And finally, community benefit is less important than all of those things. The final overarching thing I can say is that the kind of supports necessary for communities to really participate take time and take money. Like it's not surprising that the Templederry thing came out of a community development project. How do we develop our local communities? And this was the answer they chose. But it took a huge amount of accompaniment from Tipperary Energy Agency then. And I know that at the moment down in the Dingle Hub, what they're looking for is a community development worker, the soft skills around facilitation and group support, because all those SAI better energy communities don't have the resources and the supports they need to continue long enough to get over the line and actually have some concrete projects. And finally, to go back to where I started around people, Erskine Childers, the son of the president who worked for 25 years in overseas aid and development with the UN, his saying about development, which I think applies in this sphere as much as in economic development, is that all development is about people. Everything else is technique.
Oisín, thank you. I think that's a tour de force in explaining some of the challenges in rolling out ocean energy. And I think particularly some of the lessons to be learned from onshore wind. And I think many of us presumed that there would be stronger community acceptance. But when people felt that that infrastructure was not benefiting them directly, they very quickly voiced their opposition. And it has been challenging to secure permission for onshore energy. We've had lots of questions. It's 7 minutes to 12. I propose to go to perhaps 10 past 12, if that's okay, to take on some of the questions. I see 23 in the Q&A on Zoom, and we have certainly half a dozen that came in on the Facebook Live. I might ask one question to Mark Foley and then tee up another question. Mark, the question for you, I think you got a lovely softball sort of question from Oisín about your consultation, and isn't it great? But a slightly harder question might be around the data centers issue, and Oisín suggesting that they could consume up to 25% of our energy by 2030. So the question I want you to consider is, would you be, what kind of regulation would you think might help in this area? Is it co-location with new residential development so that the waste heat or energy can be used? Or what do you see happening in that area? And while you're thinking about that issue, There's another question that has come up from many others around the issue of distance from shore. It comes from Helen Galletley of Coastal Concern Alliance in Helen, who's based in Wicklow, but also from a group down in Waterford, suggesting that there should be a 22-kilometre minimum distance. Now, I think that's in place in Belgium. I'm not sure if it's in place in other member states. So maybe that's one for the rest of the panel to think about. But I'll start with this question about the data centres. And Mark, if you would like to respond to that, the challenge of data centres and what kind of regulation might be possible or achievable.
Okay, thanks for starting with a challenging one, Ciarán, but I didn't expect anything else. Listen, firstly, before looking at regulation, can we just, I suppose, reflect on we're what, 15 months working from home now. I have 600 staff. We are in the middle of the biggest social and work experiment in human history. And technology has allowed us to get on with the job in the most extraordinary and emphatic and indeed surprising way than we ever anticipated. And it's a fact of modern life that data is ubiquitous in terms of our business, in terms of how we communicate, our social lives, our entertainment. It's everywhere. And I suppose I start with the premise that it's a reality, it's a vital part of an thriving Irish economy, and an Irish economy that expects to grow and thrive in the next decade. And so I start with that thesis, and we're not in the business of stopping that progress. And then I look at, well, what can we do better? Okay, because they are big consumers of power. And I think the policy regime around data centers definitely needs a further review, considering where we are now, considering where we've got to and where we need to go. Issues like data centers being more involved in supporting green energy is one particular area I'm particularly interested in. Issues like data centers bringing solutions to the crunch that currently exists in relation to just simple capacity for generation, and they maybe should bring some solutions to bear. Data centers, I think the issue around data centers, there being some degree of hierarchy around, does everybody get to play, or should we be concentrating on those that are more strategic to the economy, and less so around data centers as a speculative play, etc. So there's some very fundamental questions I think need to be asked at this juncture, so that there's a clear, rational policy pathway for the next 10 years about what Ireland is prepared to accommodate, and the sort of the quid pro quo in terms of what the data centers are prepared to give back in terms of being accommodated by ourselves, the transmission system operator, and indeed the broader ecosystem. So I think people are right to ask the question, and people are right to ask for, shall I say, a more sophisticated policy and regulatory framework than we've had to date. What we've had to date has got us to a point where we're leaders in data centers, data center technology, etc. But I think we need a more nuanced approach going forward.
Thanks very much for that, Mark. That's interesting that there may. I certainly feel there is a need for for further regulation in this area, but you're certainly open to it. The next question I want to take, which came up from several speakers, was around the distance to shore, and the suggestion that new wind farm Dublin Array project that would significantly impact on your own project. I know from my own experience, I often take the ferry and train through North Wales, and the Gwynty Moor 600 megawatt wind farm there is 14 kilometers. So it's not the 22 kilometers. It is a very strong presence on the skyline. Personally, I like it. I see it as a sign of our low carbon future. But there are concerns about horizon pollution. I came across this phrase in the Netherlands around 10 years ago. Obviously, in a flat country, it's more of an issue. But would anybody like to row in on this issue of distance from shore and contribute from the panel on this issue? Patricia from SEAI, I'll bring you in first.
Yeah, great, thanks. And I know Peter wanted to come in on it as well. So yeah, so from my perspective, there's obviously a number of challenges in this space. And you know, in an ideal world, it would be nice to be able to set these types of limitations. But I mean, I think Alice pointed out earlier on, in our current legislation, there's no way for a project to seek any license to operate beyond the 12 nautical miles or the 22 kilometers at the moment. So they can't legally do it. That's one thing to consider. The other point to consider is depths can often be a constraint for technologies. So we in the Irish Sea are relatively lucky. We have quite shallow waters, but when we go around the coast, we find that the waters fall off quite deeply. So once you go beyond certain kilometers from the shore, you will come across depth issues. Now that can be overcome by looking at other technologies like floating wind technologies, but the reality of it is floating wind technologies are not in a place where we could deploy them at scale pre-2030 at a cost that is competitive for the consumer. I think that's the main point for us to think about. By pushing a lot of these projects further out, there is additional costs, and that will come back into the system. So it's something like, I do think that it's important for us to set guidelines around these elements, but we need to be informed in how we manage those guidelines. And we need to ensure that if there is a kind of a payoff or a need for us to consider costs, that is really well understood by the public before decisions are made around elements like this.
Yeah, I might just come in as well.
And Peter, yeah.
Yeah, I might come in as well. I mean, look, Patricia has said it correctly in terms of the sort of the technical constraints around water depth. Look, these wind farms are sited not based on their distance from shore. They're sited on the basis of the depth of water, and the current technology is capable of delivering at a competitive price in certain water depths. And as Patricia has said, the technology is just not there today, and is not going to be there in the short term to be able to move out to those deeper depths. I know the couple of comments have talked about sort of restrictions in other countries. I mean, my understanding is that in most of those regimes, the restrictions are under review, including in Germany, the Netherlands, and in Belgium. So, and the other thing to note, and it's been mentioned in a number of the comments about the average distance across the whole of Europe for wind farms. Bear in mind that is skewed to a great extent by the fact that there are projects in the North Sea that, for example, are located on places like the Dogger Bank, which are 150 kilometers from shore. And so, as you note, Ciarán, you know, you've got the Gwynty Moor project in North Wales is 12 kilometers or so. In actual fact, you've got two other sites inshore of those, which are less than 10 kilometers from shore. So there is lots of precedent for projects that are much closer to shore than those averages. And the reality is that is where we are going to have to develop these projects in order to maximize the use of best available technology, in order to minimize the environmental impacts of these projects, and in order to be able to deliver power at the best cost to the consumer.
Thank you, Peter. I might just take one last question and then do a quick tour de table with a closing sentence from each of you. But the last question is this issue of community gain or community ownership. And Oisín, you mentioned the Temple Dairy experience. I know from my discussions with colleagues in the European Parliament that Sweden and I think to a certain extent Denmark have a model of community gain that may be worth looking at. But would anyone on the panel like to talk to the issue of community gain or community ownership? I know within the clean energy package at a European level, we do have the concept of energy communities and renewable energy communities. But is there any model that people look at that we might learn from as we look towards increasing our ocean energy in Ireland. Would anyone on the panel like to take that one? I have Patricia's hand up again. Patricia.
Sorry, and I suppose there has been, as Oisin mentioned, a lot of work done in SAI on sustainable energy community, and we've over 500 sustainable energy communities in our network now, which is great to see, because it's actually blown all our targets for this space. And while I agree with what Oisin was saying earlier on, that like there is a need to really build capacity for these communities to ensure that they're not just based on the voluntary system, that that there's a real emphasis given, and I think there is opportunities to do that in time, but at the moment it's establishing the network is important, and establishing the supports for those networks. There's also been quite a lot of work on how the community benefit fund can be developed and distributed for use and support of those communities, those sustainable energy communities. But also there's SEI are working with the department on community-owned projects and how to determine them and bring them through the RES system. And I suppose the parameters for that has changed slightly, so around the percentage of ownership. So they're re-looking at kind of what applications are in the system and which still fit the current requirements. So there is a lot of work that's happening there. And I know that they have looked at the models in Denmark and elsewhere and are working on European projects with other similar systems in other jurisdictions. So definitely we're learning from what's happening. But on the offshore piece, what I would suggest is that there are opportunities for us to look at, say, smaller scale demonstration scenarios for island communities, or for the likes of, say, some of the more remote communities, like for instance, we are working with Belmullet with a test site up there. So there are opportunities for us to look at some smaller scale deployment opportunities, perhaps not in the fixed wind piece, but more in the emerging, again, with the emerging technologies with wave and floating offshore wind in particular. So I wouldn't necessarily say that communities can't operate in this space. I think we need to provide the options for them to do that, and to look at how we can maybe provide for these smaller grid scale or smaller scale projects, and also demonstration projects.
Thanks very much for that, Patricia. There are many unanswered questions. I'm happy to respond if you email my office. If you Google me, you'll get my email address easily enough. And certainly I can pass on any questions if you would like them to be redirected. But I might at this stage just do a quick tour to see if there's any closing comments from members of the panel. Alice, would you have any final words? You stressed the issue of our house compliance, and you talked about this patchwork description from the judges, but don't let me put words in your mouth.
Well, no, that's precisely the point I was going to make. We need to ensure that planning decisions and development decisions are not made in the High Court. It is the wrong forum for complex technical issues to be determined by reference to, dictionary definitions of words in legislation that has not been properly thought through.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Liam, from the Irish Maritime Development Office perspective, any final words?
Ciarán, I think it was a fascinating debate overall, and terrific contributions. Some of the things that are embedded now in my mind are the need for very, very good coordination around the entire project. I think we could do a lot more there. And I am absolutely persuaded that we can do a lot more about communicating the benefits of offshore renewable energy with all stakeholders, not in a way, not by way of propaganda, but just clear, factual information on socioeconomic benefits of adopting this approach and what it does to Ireland's absolute need to clean up the way we generate energy.
Thank you, Liam, for that. Eddie O'Connor of Mainstream.
Yeah, I unmuted there. Quicker this time. Sorry about that. Yes, development is all about, and we've been at it since for the last 30 years, and it's really all about humility and respect. You change communities when you build anything in their vicinity, and it is very much in the developer's interest to go and explain in complete detail to the local people what to do. And we've done it from the Outer Thames estuary, where 660 megawatt wind farm exists now offshore, to Jeffreys Bay in South Africa, to tiny isolated communities in Chile. And we can travel anywhere because we have as a deep value within the companies that we've been in charge of, a deep value of respect. You're going to help them and they're going to help you. It's a situation of mutual gain. And I'm all against this old model of, we're the big lads coming in here with the arrogant attitude. You'll get nowhere in that. And we do have to take this into account. There's short-term green and there's long-term green. Long-term green, and I've seen it destroy the puffin community in north of Scotland because the sand eels moved away and the breeding communities went from, I think, 100,000 down to 50 because the food went away. And that's because of global warming. So you have a big trade-off here to explain to people that you really want to make a better world for people. That's what, and once you get that across, there should be no conflict between the bird people and the developer.
Thanks for that, Eddie. Really, really interesting. Peter, from the RWE perspective, any final thoughts? We don't. I think we may have lost Peter's connection there. So Mark Foley from Airgrid, any closing sentence?
Very briefly, I think there's a very good vision coming out of government. I think the legislation and the regulatory issues are being dealt with and they're coming. I know people are very impatient, but I know they're coming. I think the technology is proven, the money is there. The biggest challenge I think we have is winning hearts and minds. We've got to communicate better. We've got to inform better. We've got to engage better. We've got to get the people of Ireland behind this. We're having conversations about 12 kilometres versus 20 kilometres. We've got to get people wanting this to happen and seeing it as being part of their future way of a low carbon living and be welcoming this infrastructure. That's the biggest challenge we've got. We'll deal with all the others.
Thanks very much, Mark, for that. Patricia Comiskey from SEAI.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Mark anymore. And I think he's made the point so well. I won't repeat it. But I also agree with Oisín in his point around listening. I think this is probably where we need to be at the moment, and we need to allow ourselves to listen if there are concerns, to try and understand them. So I think that's an important point. I would also like maybe a challenge between Birdwatch Ireland and the industry. I think the sensitivity mapping piece that you're proposing is really, really interesting, and it would be great to see kind of that we get some of the data that's been collected for industry to help inform that, because I think if we had done that on the onshore, for onshore wind, we actually would have reduced a lot of challenges that evolved over time. So I think that's a really useful piece, and I think I think it's something we should explore more closely.
Thanks very much for that, Patricia. Vincent, any closing words from Birdwatch Ireland?
Yeah, I think like everyone seems to be broadly in the same boat in terms of we all recognise the need to decarbonise our society. Offshore renewables are a massive opportunity for Ireland. We want to see it happen, but we want to see it happen in the right way. As I said in my presentation, we can't try and address the climate crisis by exacerbating our biodiversity crisis. That's going to have its own climate feedback issues and massive impacts on society and our environment. I think like some of the points I highlighted before my presentation, concerns are raised by others, legal compliance, conservation, data gaps, public participation. I think everyone around the table kind of knows the steps we need to take, the things we need to address to make this happen in the right way. I don't see those actions being taken by government. I see As Alice said, in looking at the marine planning bill, it's a plan to make a plan. From our perspective, it doesn't look legally compliant. And I'm looking at in the context as well as the Taoiseach's recent statements about, tackling the public's access to judicial review, all this kind of stuff. It just seems like I'm getting a lot of signals from government that we're going at things in the wrong way. We're not being precautionary. We're not listening. We're not gathering data. We're not doing things in a holistic way. And I think we need to slow down. We need to step back. We need to recognize that we're not enemies here. We're all in the same boat, but there's a way that we need to do this in a right way, and that we can do that by working together. And then moving forward too quickly with offshore renewables, I think would be disastrous from everyone's point of view.
Thanks very much, Vincent, for that. And then I'll give the final word on the roundup to Oisín before I just say a few words myself. Oisín from Friends of the Earth Ireland.
Thanks, Ciarán. I mean, we've been saying for a long time that Ireland was not rich in the natural resources of the fossil fuel age, but we are rich in the natural resources of the zero carbon age, of the fossil free age. And I think the challenge now, which has been really well explored today, is just how to make the most of that, how to harness that opportunity, as the title says, in a way that respects people, respects the opportunities that are there for business, and also respects the natural world. And we need to do that as fast as practical, given those considerations, given that we are in the race of a lifetime to get to zero pollution fast enough to prevent climate breakdown.
Thanks very much for that, Oisín. So look, this has been a bit of a whirlwind, a whistle-stop tour through many of the issues and challenges. And I'm really glad that we've had the interaction between different stakeholders. We are about to see new legislation published. I think these debates will continue in the public domain for a long time to come. From my own perspective, I want to really thank the panel, the participants, for the time and effort, the panel and the work you've put into your presentations. To thank the participants. We've had at least 150 joining us. I'm really pleased with that. And to thank my own staff and the Green Party staff on the technical side of things for making my job much easier. I might just mention one last event. I'm the president of EUFORA's, the European Union Forum on Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, which is an interparliamentary network. We will have our Irish Parliamentary Network meeting on Wednesday, the 16th of June here in Ireland. Brian Ledden TD is the contact point for that. And that will be an opportunity for information exchange, certainly amongst the parliamentarians, on what's working right and what interesting models we have from elsewhere within the European Union and perhaps the UK as well. I think it's been a useful debate. I think there's so much food for thought. I think Alice Whittaker from Philip Lee, her mention of this, the judge's description of the legislation and regulatory environment as a patchwork, I think sends an alarm bell ringing. And I think we as parliamentarians need to try and make that patchwork into a comfortable quilt that will limit climate change and provide benefits to all citizens in the Irish context. So just to thank you all for your participation, and I look forward to meeting you all again in some other forum. Good afternoon and thank you.